Many a murderer has been brought to justice because he overlooked some seemingly insignificant detail. But Edwin Grayson's murderer may well have felt that he was the victim of circumstances. He couldn't possibly have foreseen that a rusty 6-inch nail would have played such an instrumental part in his undoing. Edwin Grayson was a painter. He was 32, well-educated, man with a host of acquaintances but few real friends. A sort of chap who took life as he found it. He was quite prepared to borrow a fiver from a total stranger, but equally prepared, on the few occasions when he was able, to lend one on the same terms. Although his beard and his untidy way of dressing, his general disregard of convention, stamped him as the artistic type, he had little real talent, and his work met with little success. But it wasn't for reasons of economy that he chose to live all the year round in a cabin cruiser on the Thames. He genuinely liked, especially in winter when the other craft were covered and silent, the peace and seclusion of living on a boat moored in the middle of a river, with a small dinghy his only contact with the outside world. It was quite usual for him to shut himself away for days on end, so nobody missed him, and his body wasn't discovered until a local boatman noticed a light in the Lady Dot's cabin. As the dinghy wasn't tied to the cruiser's stern, he naturally supposed that Grayson had gone away and left it burning, so he rowed out to switch it off for him. He found Grayson lying on the cabin floor, dead. For some reason or other, Edwin Grayson's murder never became front-page news. In fact, except for a vague recollection of reading a small paragraph headlined, "Artist Found Shot on River," I knew nothing about it until Bob dropped in one evening. Bob's a detective inspector and an old friend of mine. And about once a month he drops in for dinner, and the conversation afterwards usually gets round to the subject of crime. We've spent many interesting evenings discussing his past cases. His favorite trick is to introduce the main characters, explain their possible motives, present me with the available clues, and then sit back and watch me try to supply a solution. He calls me his budding criminologist and delights in testing my powers of deduction. Well, he did this with the Grayson case. There were two main suspects. Both had strong motive, both had opportunity, and both were capable of murder. They were James Turner and Lance Crawford. Turner, a self-made businessman, had married Sally Crawford 2 years previously. On the face of it, they had little in common. Turner was a rough diamond and past his prime, while Sally was young, attractive, and the daughter of a very well-connected, if not wealthy, family. However, the arrangement seemed to work fairly well at first. Turner regarded a pretty young wife with Sally's background as an expensive but desirable possession, a sign of prosperity. Sally, for her part, seemed content with the material benefits that went with being married to a very wealthy man. At least she was before she met Edwin Grayson. Lance Crawford was Sally's elder brother. Lance was a person of infinite charm and above average intelligence, but he was also a person who regarded the problem of earning a living as something that must be avoided at all costs. At school, he'd been a keen sportsman, but not so keen a scholar. Lazy, could do better, was his headmaster's way of putting it. He joined up in 1940, and his army career was a mixture of extremes. MC and bar, closely followed by a court-martial for misappropriating regimental funds. After the war, he tried his hand at numerous jobs. All were unsuccessful and short-lived. He was always hard up, and to satisfy his expensive tastes, he sponged off his friends and relations unmercifully. After he'd married Sally, Turner had given Lance a position in his firm. But, as usual, Lance refused to put his back into the job, and Turner soon gave up any hope he may have had of turning Lance into a business executive, and came to regard him solely as an additional liability that went with his young wife. But not content with a generous salary for doing nothing, Lance was continually trying to bleed Turner further through Sally. Sometimes it was to pay a persistent bookmaker, sometimes to buy a new car, sometimes even a yacht. He'd been very keen on sailing ever since his school days. At first, Sally was more often than not able to help him. Turner didn't keep a very tight hold on the purse strings, and in spite of his failings, she was genuinely fond of her brother. But now, things were different. She couldn't risk upsetting Turner, as she was deceiving him in another way. She'd met Edwin Grayson at a little club down by the river, and they were instantly attracted to one another. To Sally, Edwin was the answer to a dream. Somebody different, somebody unpredictable, somebody peculiarly charming and attractive. She found herself completely unable to resist his advances, and very soon she was spending 1 or 2 evenings a week on his cruiser. Although he'd been responsible in the first place for introducing them, Lance very soon became worried the way things were going. He knew that if there was a split between Turner and his sister, it would mean the end of his life of ease and luxury. He'd be faced with the horrible prospect of earning a living. For Turner made no secret of the fact that he only tolerated him for Sally's sake. Lance tried desperately to break up the friendship. He pleaded with Sally, cursed and swore at Grayson, but without effect. Neither of them took any notice of him.
Well, the question was, had he gone as far as murdering Grayson to get rid of him? At first sight, it looked very much as if he had. It was his pistol, a .38 Army-type revolver, that was found in the cabin of the Lady Dot, and he admitted having gone to see Grayson that night. But when questioned, he stuck to his story that Grayson had telephoned him around 9:30 and asked him to come and see him. Hoping that this signified a change of heart over Sally, he agreed to go.
Grayson had said that he was getting rowed back to the Lady Dot and would leave the dinghy at the landing stage for him. But when Lance arrived at the landing stage 15 minutes later, there was no sign of him. He shouted 2 or 3 times, but got no reply, although the lights were burning in the cruiser's cabin. He therefore decided that Grayson, for some reason, had changed his mind and didn't want to keep their appointment, so he returned home. The police surgeon put the time of death at around 9:30, and Lance contended it must have occurred just before he arrived. He could offer no explanation of how his pistol came to be in the cabin of the cruiser, but he was careful to point out that Turner was one of the few people that knew of its existence. Turner denied all knowledge of the pistol. He also denied that he'd ever heard of a painter called Edwin Grayson, let alone that he knew his wife was having an affair with him. He said that on the night of the murder he'd been working in his office until 11:30, and the caretaker confirmed that the light was on until that time. though of course it would have been quite simple for Turner to have slipped out the back way unnoticed. But if Turner had killed his wife's lover, why hadn't he provided himself with a more plausible alibi? He must have known that he'd be the first person to be suspected. On the other hand, if Lance was the killer, why had he been so foolish as to leave his pistol in the cabin of the cruiser? Whichever of the two killed Grayson didn't seem to have taken much trouble to cover up his tracks. This worried Bob for a while, but he went on to tell me how it was the Lady Dot's dinghy that first put him onto the track of the right man. The dinghy was found waterlogged and drifting half a mile downstream. On salvaging, it was discovered that a plank at the stern was holed level with the waterline. The timber had been crushed by a blow from the outside. Back at the landing stage, there was an old rusty 6-inch bolt sticking out from the fender pile. It was level with the water, so it was very probably that was responsible for holding the dinghy. But having taken me this far, Bob stopped and looked at me. I knew from past experience what that meant. It meant he considered he'd given me enough information for me to deduce not only what happened to the dinghy, but whether it was James Turner or Lance Crawford that killed the painter. An experienced yachtsman like Lance Crawford would never, under any circumstances, have brought a dinghy into land downstream. He'd have instinctively rowed in upstream. It was Turner, impersonating Grayson's voice, who'd phoned Lance and asked him to come down to the river. His idea was to kill two birds with one stone, to dispose of his wife's lover, and at the same time, rid himself of her parasite brother. He intended that Lance should be accused of Grayson's murder. If the dinghy hadn't sunk and Lance had rowed out to the Lady Dot, then the plan might well have been successful. Caught red-handed in the cabin, as Turner intended he should be, with his own gun and the murdered man, he'd have found it very difficult to prove that he hadn't fired the fatal shot. Of course, Bob didn't have enough evidence to prove that Turner was guilty straight away, but it was enough to set the wheels of the law in motion. Other evidence came to light subsequently, and Turner was charged with the murder of his wife's lover. As he stood in the dock awaiting sentence, he may well have cursed those 6 inches of rusty steel.